The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio with Dr. Alex Heublein and Dr. Josh Klapow. This is Adapt or Perish.
Welcome to Adapt or Perish, along with Dr. Alex Heublein, president of Adaptigent. I am Dr. Josh Klapow, and joining us today, Alex, we have, I like to call him Sir James Michael Keats. Jamie is our producer. He is our technologist at TKR. He is a photographer extraordinaire. He has a host, Alex, of talents that literally will just blow you away when it comes to digital, when it comes to tech. Jamie produces this show every week, and today's topic, quantum computing, was Jamie's idea. And so we figured as long as Jamie's idea, we might as well have him on. So Jamie, how are you?
I'm super, Josh. I am stoked to be with both of you guys. This is really an exciting topic for me. And also, it's about the future. And I think that that's a really fun thing to talk about in general. So thank you for having me so much, guys.
I forgot something too in your bio. Oh my God, I forgot, because we always do this. Jamie's also a celebrity. We always.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I know. But Jamie, no, he is. He's famous. Alex, he's famous. Jamie was in The Walking Dead.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yes. So Jamie, that's like famous.
You know, I don't like to talk about this. I don't like to talk about this.
Well, it's fine, but for podcast purposes, and
he doesn't like to talk about zombies. Come on, man.
He was one.
I died. Okay, it's not as cool as it sounds. Thank you though for mentioning that. That's awesome. I did have a lot of fun on that show, and it will always be an awesome memory. And you guys should watch the episode.
I died. Okay, so Jamie, tell both of us where the interest is, but more, I think equally important, what the interest is and why. When we were saying, let's riff on some topics, that you really brought this one forward.
So when I was a kid, every day I was watching Star Trek. It was just the thing I was interested in when I was a kid, and they talk about all sorts of cool technologies that we all wish were available to us in the world. And you will often hear somebody saying something about quantum this or quantum that. And, it's just sort of a buzzword. But I suppose it stuck with me because later on, when we started to hear about quantum computing and quantum physics and all of this stuff and how it can help us in our everyday lives, obviously it came back up. I'm like, dude, I've heard this plenty of times before. And so I'm tuning into basically anything that I could. And so I suppose that's where the interest originated. And today, especially as a fairly politically motivated adult, I see all sorts of interesting problems that exist that our current systems of computing and the way we, experiment, how we put resources into projects and all this sort of stuff. There really are a lot of super neat ideas that are out there of how these systems could help us go into, hopefully, a better world, better for everybody.
Okay, so Alex, help us, because you're the academician.
You think I know something about this?
Well, dude, I'm already so lost. I got the Star Trek part, Jamie, because I watched Star Trek and I just wanted to be able to be transported and be able to come back safely and all that. I thought that was really cool, but I'm so don't understand this. I told you all both before this. I was like, I don't understand. So Alex, can you give, I'm sure there's at least one listener besides me who also doesn't understand. So maybe just give us some foundational stuff, but particularly, obviously, with the bent of our show, how this is relevant for business broadly defined.
Yeah, well, I think to understand the quantum world and to understand it in maybe a little more detail than Star Trek or the Marvel movies that incorporate all this magic quantum stuff. I think it's kind of worth taking a little trip back in time and look at a bit about physics. Physics is a relatively new discipline. We've really only been doing it for 200-300 years. And sort of really the first big breakthroughs in physics were understanding the world around us. And by around us, I mean sort of the immediate vicinity, things that were that we could experiment with a couple hundred years ago, like, taking a cannonball and shooting it and see what arc it followed. And there's physics behind that, right? There's math and there's physical properties around things that occur in our world, on our sort of planet, on our scale. So that's called Newtonian physics, right? So Sir Isaac Newton kind of kicked off a lot of this, and a whole bunch of other people contributed, but it's really the physics of the everyday world, so to speak, sort of at our level. And then the next wave in physics came along, and that was really more around what happens when things go to extremes, like really large extremes. And so that's a lot of the work that Einstein and others did. And we, sometimes we call that relativistic physics. What happens at the really big scale? And what happens when you go really, really fast? And so there's a whole body of knowledge that was developed around what happens at sort of a planetary or a galactic scale, and particularly what happens as you go really, really fast.
Dude, you just said galactic.
I know I did.
That was awesome.
Got a $5 bet with a friend of mine that I'm going to work in a couple of words like that.
All right, keep going.
But yeah, it's stuff that happens at really big scales, right? And then the third big phase of physics, or one of the big areas that people got into was, okay, well, we know what happens at kind of the normal scale, our scale as humans. We kind of know what happens at the really big scale as you get to extremes on the large side. Well, what happens on the small scale, like the really, really small scale? And that's really where we enter the realm of the quantum world. And that's what happens at almost unimaginably small scales. And what you find out about both the really big scale as well as the really small scale of the quantum world is that things don't work like they do at our scale. And things that we think would scale up or scale down, physics principles and laws and things, those things break down pretty quickly when you get really, really big or really, really small. And so that's really where the quantum world is, in that very, very small. And what we see are some really counterintuitive things that happen when things get very, very small. And that's kind of what we're seeing today, is people saying, well, how can we take advantage of this really strange, bizarre physics that happens at the scale of the very, very small?
Okay. So I'm sorry. Okay, that's freaking,
you weren't ready for this
great.
One, were you, Dr. Josh?
No, this is one of those ones. Like, that's great. No, I mean that was great. Okay, now what?
Well, so some strange things happen, right?
I did see. By the way, I saw Ant-Man.
Well, yeah. So you saw Ant-Man. That's the classic Marvel example of this stuff, right? And I think that's where most people kind of figured out, right? Well, so for starters, things get really strange. A very famous physicist, Richard Feynman, once said that, and I quote, "Nobody understands quantum mechanics because it's so counterintuitive." So, for instance, when you get down to the very small scale, you start to see some very bizarre behavior, things that really shouldn't happen in the sort of macro world that we live in. And the other thing you find is that not only is it strange, it goes from being very deterministic to being very probabilistic. So things that we think of are in the sort of normal physics world. We go, if this happens and then this happens, and then you apply this, then this other thing will happen. And it always happens. But when you get down to the very small scale, it doesn't always happen. It's just a matter of probability. It's likely that it will happen. In fact, it's overwhelmingly likely that it will happen, but it's not guaranteed to happen. So you move from this world of being very deterministic, being very, very predictable, down to this level in the world where things aren't quite as predictable. And that's very counterintuitive as well. So you start to see a lot of different effects happen as well. So you can study very small particles or even subatomic particle level stuff, but some strange stuff starts happening. Like, so for instance, things start behaving in ways that are counterintuitive to the way that we think things should behave. So for instance, when you look at the quantum world, you find that you find, effects that are unusual. So there's this idea of quantum entanglement, which says I can take two particles and I can entangle them together, meaning that the state that they're in is linked together. And the cool part about it is that I can take those particles and I can move them vast distances from one another. And they appear to be able to somehow communicate over this very vast distance instantaneously, like way faster than the speed of light, which should be impossible. So if I make changes to one of them, and I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but if I observe the state of one, I can determine the state of the other, even though, or if I change the state of one, the state of the other changes over really vast distances. And this freaked everybody out. Everybody was like, no, that can't possibly be happening. It violates all kinds of laws of physics that we see at the macro level. And then also at the super huge level, we know that the speed of light is a constant, and it's a barrier you run into. So you can't go faster than the speed of light. But it appears as though these entangled particles can actually they're somehow linked via some kind of force that occurs instantaneously. So that's one example of really, really strange stuff. And it really freaked Einstein out. He called it spooky action at a distance. Like, he didn't buy into this thing. And he's a pretty smart guy, right?
Yeah.
And he was looking at this stuff going, man, this is crazy. So you get into some very strange effects that happen. And these effects start to really, as we make computer chips smaller and smaller, we start to see some of these effects take over. So when we design microprocessors, for instance, microprocessors are really very, very large. You can almost think of it as like running water through a bunch of pipes. And so the pipes have little gates in them that will open and close, and it's all about the flow of that water in those pipes. Now, really, it's a bunch of silicon channels, and you're running electrons through all this stuff, right? But what happens as you start to get really, really small is that those electrons that go nicely down these little pipes we've created in silicon, they'll start tunneling right through the walls of the silicon. And it's called the quantum tunneling effect. And so that applies to us in the real world. And as we continue to shrink microprocessors and we get more and more powerful, more power efficient microprocessors, we run into some of these barriers that we didn't have to worry about earlier. And so that, I think, ultimately will limit what we can do in terms of, you can only shrink things down to a certain size before these quantum effects start taking over. And then you've got to rethink your strategy on how to design and manufacture microprocessors. And those, obviously, microchips are in everything. We did a whole episode on that one. Mm-hmm. But that's a big challenge, right? But it also presents a lot of opportunities. So if you look at it in the computing world, one of the interesting things that happens is that, going back to entangling those particles together, well, it turns out if I entangle a bunch of them together, and then I ask I can basically build a little computer out of those entangled particles. It's called a quantum computer. And what you find is that it can do certain types of calculations infinitely faster than a traditional computer. Because if you think about a computer, we represent everything as either a 1 or a 0. There's really no in between, right? It's just these giant long strings of 1s and 0s. In fact, I joke sometimes with some of the developers at Adaptigent. I tell them, hey guys, our job is really to produce really, really long strings of 1s and 0s. Yep. At the end of the day, right? That's what we do. That's what software is, right? At the end of the day, it ends up being really big, long strings of 1s and 0s. But the neat thing about the quantum computers is that each one of those bits of information can represent a 1 or a 0, or actually it can represent a 1 and a 0 simultaneously. And so what that allows us to do is solve problems that have lots of, for instance, permutations to them. And when you have a problem where there's 100 variables, and each of those variables could have one or more values to those variables, it gets very hard to figure out, let's say, what's the most optimal solution based on 100 different variables. That takes a long time for a traditional computer to figure out, but it happens very, very quickly in a quantum computer. So it gives us some processing power that we've just never had before. And it can solve problems that would take a standard computer like the one on your laptop or your desktop or whatever, or even supercomputers. It would take these supercomputers thousands of years to work through all these permutations, whereas the quantum computers can do it in seconds because they can represent those ones and zeros simultaneously. So you get all the solutions all at once.
So Jamie, okay, Jamie, so my head's blown. And given that you brought this interest in, now that Alex has given us this foundation, which much of which you may have known.
I'm so glad that he did that, though, because I was hoping I wasn't going to have to try to talk science.
So where does that take you? Like, where does that take you as somebody who has a deep interest in this as well? Because again, like I said, here's the only piece of everything that Alex just said that I sort of dialed into. In the world of behavioral science, everything is probabilistic. There is no guarantees, but there are absolutely. We talk about somebody is more likely to engage in this behavior than that behavior. We talk about it in terms of probabilities. So other than that, I'm completely out.
Let me give you another example that I think might be easier to understand. One of the quantum effects that I think you'll really relate to, and I think more people will relate to.
Jamie, this is for me, by the way. This is not for you. This is
I think it's actually for everyone, because one of the spookiest things we find out about the quantum world is that there's this idea called the observer effect. And there's an idea in the quantum world that just merely observing something happening can change the outcome of what happens. So think about your role as an executive coach, right?
Yes.
You go in, you do executive coaching, right? And I'm sure as part of that, you do a lot of observation of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so the challenge you run into, though, when you do that, is that when people know they're being observed, they act differently.
Yeah, it's a Hawthorne effect.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's well known in psychology, right? People that are under observation will behave differently than people that think they're not under observation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you get into that in the quantum world, in the sense that not only can observations affect reality of what the reality of what you're observing, but there's this idea in the quantum world that the act of observation is actually what determines the outcome. That we live in a universe that's called an observer-dependent universe. And we're getting into philosophy here a little bit, metaphysics. But there's this idea that the world actually functions as a result of observations, not as a result of things that happen independent of the observer, right? It's the classic, if there's a tree that falls in the woods and there was no one around, did it make a sound? Well, it turns out in the quantum world, when you get to the very small, the answer is probably no. It probably doesn't make a sound. If there's no observer, these things don't actually happen, or they don't become deterministic until somebody observes things, right? So it's a very similar analogy to people. When you observe people, they act differently if they know they're being observed. And so you get into a situation in the quantum world where it's spooky too, right? Because you think, well, gosh, if a tree falls in the woods, man, it's going to make a sound regardless of whether I happen to be there to hear it or not. And that's true at the macro level. But when you get down to the very small level, that starts not to be true. And that's creepy when you think about it, because everything in the world is made up of these subatomic particles, right? I mean, everything, literally. It's like the old joke about there's an old joke about atoms, is why should you never trust atoms? And the answer is, well, they make up everything. But it's true, right? So yeah, so that's an example of a quantum effect, maybe that is a little easier to understand. We see it at the macro level when we're talking about people in psychology, but we also see it when we get very, very small in the universe and we start looking at things at a very, very tiny level. It turns out the interaction of the observer and the observed, there's an interesting reaction going on there that we don't fully understand yet.
There was a
all right, Jane.
Yeah,
go.
I was the concept of observation, I think, makes me think. You know where I'm going to go with this, Alex, with the double slit experiment, which was done like what 100 and some years ago originally. But this absolutely blew my mind, guys. I was in like a 101 astronomy course at school, and my professor was describing this experiment where they were trying to determine if light was traveling in the form of a particle or as a wave. And, waves have certain attributes and particles have certain attributes. And so I guess they were using light, correct me if it's like light bulbs or something. And they were shining lights through these two little slits, like a wall, but they had these little openings, and they were trying to see how the light would appear on the other side. And just as if you were to drop a pebble into a like a still pond or something, it's going to create a ripple kind of emanating out. And if there's any sort of interruption, certain parts of that ripple wave is going to get through. And then if you have two of those little openings, you have two little parts of the original wave that's getting through. And what ends up happening is you have certain parts of those waves as they interact, canceling out others, and it is acting like a wave. The original experiment showed that light does indeed act like a wave, but later on we had scientists sort of redo that experiment, but they were using collated light, so they were able to shoot individual particles. Well, we know now, I suppose, that in the instance of observation, they start to act like particles is the kind of punchline here, but we were supposed to see that same interference pattern sort of on the other side on like a wall that could detect what was happening in a really like scientific way. They knew how much light was getting through and what it would look like, where the concentration was supposed to be, all of that. But what happened was they were seeing it act like particles. Instead of that interference pattern where you have sort of a spread of different impacts, they were seeing just two spots. And that totally blew people's minds. The really weird thing is, though, it started out with the interference pattern. And then when they put the observer in, the little thing that was measuring how much light was getting through, that's when it started to act differently. So all the situations were exactly the same, except for they added that little detector, and then it started to behave differently. And so that, I think, melted my brain when I heard about it as a kid, and it really got me interested in this, because this is, like you were saying, Alex, it's really like the spooky stuff happening on the quantum level. And really what I think has happened, I think scientists are obviously all over this now. A lot of money's going into it. I think something like $30 billion last year across the world. Unfortunately, the United States isn't putting as much, but some countries are just dumping money into this because there are tons of applications, and they're trying to figure out how to use this very unique tool that nature has apparently provided for us to learn how to use to do all sorts of different things, make new calculations. We're talking climate change and weather forecasting and how to create better medicines. I mean, things that would take us just years and years of trial and error, and we don't want to make big changes. We want to make small incremental changes. All that just takes a lot of time. But a quantum system is going to be able to sort of take all the data that we have and give us a much better direction of how we should spend our money, how we should bring in different resources, even down to where this should be done. If you input that into the computer, like what facilities are available to accomplish these different really complex tasks, and that's going to cut just years, tens of years, perhaps more, off of these really wild problems that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And you kind of look at the double slit experiment. I mean, it was really creepy, because the other thing they found was that, and we'll talk more maybe in just a second about the practical implications of some of this stuff. But the really creepy part was they would shoot one photon through, and they would shoot one photon through, and then they would shoot another one through the other slit later. And then the creepy part was that they still got that interference pattern
without the detector, right?
Yeah. And so the really strange part is it almost looks like this stuff works backwards in time. And that's really creepy, right? It only starts to make us question sort of how does time flow, and are there, there's this idea in science that, in order to get an effect, there has to be a cause for that effect. But what they found in the quantum world is there are effects that don't have causes. That arrow of causality doesn't necessarily exist in certain circumstances. And that blows your mind when you think about it, because that's a fundamental tenet of science, is that if I do this, it should have this effect. But then they find, no, there's just effects. There's no actual cause for these things. So this whole idea of a causal mechanism in the universe may not actually be the case when you get down to this very small level. But taking it back up to the practical level, I mean, believe it or not, you probably use and leverage quantum effects every single day. Before the show here, I was upstairs, and my son and his friend, they're both 5 years old. They were watching a Disney movie on the television that we have in the living room. And it is one of those QLED TVs, the Q standing for quantum. Now, that just sounds like a marketing term to most people. And at first I thought, yeah, okay, quantum, LED, whatever. This is just a bunch of marketing hoo-ha. But it turns out that those TVs that have the quantum capabilities, they use a very special principle of light that only happens at the very, very small scale. And so what that allows them to do is modify the light that's coming out of the television to produce much more accurate, much more a wider gamut of colors that come out of those TVs. So it's not just a marketing thing. They're actually literally using a quantum effect of light to be able to produce more vivid and more accurate colors. And that kind of blew my mind. I was like, wow, we use this stuff every day. If you have a large hard drive in your computer, maybe you have a desktop computer with a very, very large hard drive, they actually use a quantum effect to store data called the giant magnetoresistive effect. I think that's what it's called. But it's a quantum effect that allows them to store data on these hard drives in a more dense fashion than you would be able to do kind of at a macro level. So we see this stuff actually in our day-to-day lives. We don't know that we're actually using it. But if you have one of those QLED or quantum TVs, you're seeing a real-life quantum effect every time you turn on your television.
All right, guys. So I know that time and space is all contorted in the quantum world, but like this show actually exists on a non-quantum level. So we've reached the end of our time, unless maybe we haven't. And now I don't even know. But my stopwatch is saying that we've reached the end. But I did want to ask, Jamie, you gave several examples of kind of where this could and should be. Alex has given us practical examples. The last statement that you have is, where do you think we should be concentrating these applications, just from more of a social and maybe even just personal or professional interest standpoint? Where would you like to see this more and more emphasized?
For sure. Thanks for the opportunity to answer that. That's, I guess, where the passion is today. I was trying to think about some quick practical things, and did a little research, and I found a number of things that I think would be great. Really, quantum computers are going to help us solve, again, these super complex issues that involve a lot of probability. And so I'm thinking about things that we haven't been able to really crack yet. For example, I know I'm going to throw out some weird ones here, but just understand this is a possibility. Cold fusion, I think, is something that we haven't been able to figure out. It's just a goofy science fiction idea, but it's totally possible. And imagine what we could do off a gallon of water instead of all this fuel that we keep burning. I think in the meantime, we can work on risk assessment for businesses, economic forecast, these sorts of things. How can we save money and potentially lives in that case? Eventually, we're going to start seeing quantum systems used as we develop artificial intelligence and develop machine learning, and seeing those things work in tandem is both tantalizing and I would say terrifying. Animation and virtual reality, as someone who enjoys video games and how all that stuff's going, be able to create these massively immersive environments that have just tons of elements moving around each other. I think all that is huge. Really anything, Josh, that involves wildly complex modeling, wherever that's required, I think
Mm-hmm.
quantum can really hook us up. I mean, predicting tornadoes. I could go on for a long time, but all that sort of stuff is just super interesting. And I think you could take any number of those, and if we had a solution or we had a direction, I think that could just really motivate the scientific community or those who perform research in these various areas to get us to a solution faster and ultimately improve the lives of those who live on the planet with us.
I love that. That made sense. That made a hell of a lot of sense. Sorry, Alex. Jamie made sense. I didn't understand a damn thing you said.
You were no help in explaining this.
No. Listen, that was great, Jamie. Thank you for joining us, Alex. As always, thank you for enlightening us. And every single time, Jamie, that I do a show with Alex, I start wondering what is his PhD in?
Everything.
First, I thought it was business. Then I thought it was like computer science. Then I thought it was psychology. Now I think it's physics. No, but that was great discussion. We are out of time. I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's show of Adapt or Perish. Please stay tuned to Tony Curry Radio because that's where you can always hear the next episode of Adapt or Perish. And let me just say this. If you have questions and you want to get a hold of us, email us. And you can email us at info@tonycurryradio.net. Again, that's info@tonycurryradio.net. For Alex Heublein, James Michael Keats, this is Josh Klapow, and we thank you for joining us for this episode of Adapt or Perish.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Curry Radio.